At the reading of my wife's will, my son-in-law said coldly, "I'll take the business, the house, and the car. The old lazy bum gets the taxes." Everyone laughed at me. Until the lawyer said, "Actually, the company was never in her name. It was under the name, I'm glad to have you here." Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Donald, and I'm 64 years old. I never thought the worst day of my life would come after I'd already buried my wife. The funeral home smelled like lilies and regret. Margaret had been gone for 3 days, and I still couldn't believe she wasn't coming home. 42 years of marriage, and now I was sitting in a leather chair that squeaked every time I shifted, surrounded by people who hadn't spoken to me in months. The lawyer, Mr. Henderson, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. He was a thin man with gray hair and the kind of serious expression that made you want to confess sins you'd never committed. Margaret had chosen him years ago, and I'd never questioned it. I never questioned much of anything Margaret did. "We're here today for the reading of Margaret Ann Mitchell's last will and testament," Henderson began, his voice echoing in the small conference room. My daughter Ava sat across from me, her eyes red from crying. At 38, she still looked like the little girl who used to climb into my lap when thunderstorms scared her, but those days were long gone. Next to her sat Martin, my son-in-law, checking his phone like he had somewhere better to be. He was wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in a year. Martin had always looked at me like I was something stuck to the bottom of his shoe. Even now, with Margaret barely in the ground, he couldn't hide his impatience. He kept glancing at his watch and sighing loudly. "The deceased has left specific instructions regarding the distribution of her assets," Henderson continued. I noticed how he avoided looking directly at anyone. Maybe he knew what was coming. My hands were shaking. I pressed them against my knees, hoping nobody would notice. The truth was, I had no idea what Margaret had planned. We'd been married for decades, but she'd always handled the business side of things. I just did what she told me to do. Martin leaned forward in his chair, suddenly interested. "How long is this going to take? I have a conference call at 4. Ava touched his arm. "Martin, please, this is important." He shrugged her off. "Important, sure. But we all know how this goes. Margaret built the business from nothing. She was the one with the vision, the drive. Not like some people who just coasted." The way he said it, the way his eyes flicked toward me, made my stomach clench. I kept my mouth shut. What was the point of arguing? Martin had made his opinion of me clear years ago. Henderson shuffled through his papers. Mrs. Mitchell owned Mitchell Consulting Services, the family home on Maple Street, 2 rental properties, and various other assets totaling approximately $2.7 million. I heard Ava gasp softly. Even I was surprised by that number. I knew Margaret had done well with the business, but I had no idea we were worth that much. Martin sat up straighter like a dog that had just caught a scent. $2.7 million? "That's correct," Henderson said. My son-in-law was practically salivating. I could see the wheels turning in his head, calculating what this meant for his lifestyle, his image, his future. He'd always been obsessed with money and status. It's why he'd married Ava, I suspected. She was beautiful and came from what he assumed was a successful family. "Now," Henderson continued, regarding the distribution of assets. Martin interrupted again. "Look, let's cut to the chase here. I'll be taking over the business operations. Ava and I will move into the house on Maple Street. It's better for the kids anyway, bigger yard. We can rent out Donald's place, add it to the rental income portfolio." He said it like it was already decided, like I wasn't even sitting right there. "Martin," Ava whispered, but he waved her off. "What? We all know how this works. Margaret was the breadwinner. She built everything from scratch while Donald here." He gestured at me dismissively. "Well, let's just say some people are builders and some people are not." The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. I felt my face burning with shame. This was Margaret's funeral, and Martin was already dividing up her life like she was a pie at a church potluck. Henderson looked uncomfortable. "Perhaps we should proceed with the actual reading of the will." Martin leaned back in his chair, that smug smile spreading across his face. "Of course, sorry. I'm just thinking practically here. The old lazy bum can keep paying the property taxes on whatever little piece we throw his way. Consider it his contribution to the family for once." Ava's face went white. "Martin, stop." But he was on a roll now, feeding off his own cruelty. "I mean, let's be honest. What has Donald ever contributed? Margaret did all the work, made all the money, built the business. He just existed, took up space. A few of Margaret's relatives, people I barely knew, actually chuckled, actually laughed at me while my wife's body was barely cold in the ground. I wanted to defend myself, to say something, anything, but what could I say? That for 42 years I'd watched Margaret succeed while I felt like I was disappearing a little more each day? That I'd spent decades feeling useless, unnecessary, like exactly what Martin said I was. Dead weight. The laughter died down, and Martin looked directly at me. Don't take it personally, Donald. We all have our roles to play. Margaret was the achiever. You were. Well, you were there. Henderson cleared his throat again, louder this time. If I may continue with the reading? Please, Martin said, settling back like a king waiting to hear about his new kingdom. I stared down at my hands, folded in my lap. 64 years old, and this is what my life had come to. A joke. A burden. The old lazy bum who would be grateful for whatever scraps they decided to throw my way. Henderson opened the will and began to read. I, Margaret Ann Mitchell, being of sound mind and body, but I wasn't really listening anymore. I was thinking about how I'd failed, how I'd let my wife down, let my daughter down, let myself down. I was thinking about all the times Martin had made those little comments, all the family gatherings where I'd felt like an outsider in my own life. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was just a lazy old man who'd been lucky enough to marry someone better than him. Regarding Mitchell Consulting Services and all associated business holdings, I closed my eyes and waited for the final humiliation to begin. But then Henderson said something that made me look up, something that changed everything. Actually, there seems to be some confusion here. Henderson's words hung in the air, but my mind had already drifted somewhere else, somewhere darker, back to all the moments that had led me to this chair, in this room, being treated like a piece of furniture that nobody wanted but couldn't quite throw away. I remembered the first time Martin had looked at me with that expression. It was 7 years ago at Ava's wedding. I was walking her down the aisle, trying not to cry, when I caught sight of Martin's family in the front row. His father owned 3 car dealerships. His mother wore diamonds that caught the church light like tiny stars. They looked at me like I was the help. After the ceremony, Martin's father, Robert, had pulled me aside. So, Donald, what line of work are you in? I help my wife with her consulting business, I'd said, proud of Margaret's success. Robert had smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Help how? I'd stammered something about administrative work, about being supportive. The truth was more complicated than that. But Robert didn't wait for a real answer. Well, he'd said, clapping me on the shoulder, it's good that Margaret found her calling. Some people are just natural entrepreneurs. The implication was clear. I was not one of those people. That night after the reception, I'd found Ava crying in the hotel bathroom. She was still in her wedding dress, mascara streaking down her cheeks. Dad, she'd said when she saw me, I'm scared I made a mistake. I'd held her while she cried, told her that marriage was always scary, that Martin loved her. But deep down, I'd seen how he looked at other people's success, how hungry he was for status and recognition. I'd seen how he looked at me. The years that followed proved my instincts right. Martin treated our family gatherings like networking events. He'd spend the entire time talking about his job, his promotions, his achievements. When people asked about me, he'd change the subject or make jokes about retired life, even though I was nowhere near retirement age. Donald's our family philosopher, he'd say with that laugh that made my skin crawl. Always thinking deep thoughts, right, Don? He made it sound like thinking was a luxury for people who didn't have real work to do. The worst part wasn't Martin's condescension, though. It was watching Ava change. My daughter, who used to call me every Sunday just to talk, started making excuses. She was busy with Martin's work events, his family's social calendar, their new friends who worked in finance and law and other impressive-sounding fields. You understand, don't you, Dad? She'd say when she canceled our lunch plans for the 3rd time in a month. Martin's boss is having this dinner party, and it's really important for his career. I always said I understood. What else could I say? Margaret tried to bridge the gap. She'd invite them over for dinner, plan family vacations, buy expensive gifts for their kids. But even she started to change after a while. She'd get defensive when Martin made his comments, like she was embarrassed by me too. Donald works very hard, she'd say, but her voice sounded tired, like she was tired of having to defend me. The breaking point came 2 years ago at Christmas. We were all gathered at our house, and Martin was telling everyone about his latest promotion. He was the regional sales manager now, making 6 figures, driving a company car. It's funny, he'd said, looking around the room with that smile, how life works out. Some people just have that drive, you know, that hunger for success. And others, he'd glanced at me, sitting in my usual chair by the window. Others are content to just exist. Margaret's sister Linda had laughed. Well, not everyone can be a go-getter like you, Martin. True, Martin had said. Take Donald here. 50 years of, what exactly? I mean, what would you put on a resume? Professional husband. The room had erupted in laughter. Everyone except Ava, who stared at her hands, and Margaret, who suddenly found something fascinating about her wine glass. I'd excused myself and gone to the basement. I'd sat down there for 2 hours, listening to the party continue above me, wondering when I'd become the family joke. When everyone finally left that night, Margaret had come downstairs to find me. "Don," she'd said softly, "you know he doesn't mean it, right? He's insecure. Successful people often are." I'd wanted to ask her if she was embarrassed by me too. If she wished she'd married someone more like Martin, someone who could match her ambition and drive. But I was too afraid of the answer. Instead, I just nodded and said, "I know." But I didn't know. I didn't know anything anymore. The truth was, I'd been disappearing for years. Not physically, but in every way that mattered. I'd become invisible in my own life, a supporting character in everyone else's story. Margaret was the successful businesswoman. Ava was the devoted daughter and mother. Martin was the rising star. And me? I was the old lazy bum who paid the taxes and tried to stay out of the way. Sitting in that lawyer's office, listening to Martin plan out my future like I was a piece of property to be managed, I realized this was how it was always going to be. Even after Margaret was gone, even after 42 years of marriage, I was still just the help. Still just the guy who existed in the background while more important people made the real decisions. Martin was still talking, something about property management and tax implications. Henderson was shuffling papers, looking more uncomfortable by the minute. Ava was staring out the window, probably wishing she was anywhere else. And me? I was remembering every slight, every dismissive comment, every time someone had made me feel like I was taking up space I didn't deserve. Maybe they were right. Maybe I really was just a burden. But then Henderson spoke again, and something in his voice made me pay attention. "I'm afraid there's been a significant misunderstanding here." Henderson's voice cut through the room like a knife through warm butter. The uncomfortable shuffling of papers stopped. Martin's confident rambling died mid-sentence. Even Ava looked up from the window, her attention suddenly focused on the lawyer's weathered face. "I'm sorry," Martin said, his tone shifting from casual arrogance to barely concealed irritation. "What kind of misunderstanding?" Henderson removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, deliberately. I'd seen this move before in business meetings with Margaret. It was the kind of pause that meant someone was about to deliver news that would change everything. "Well," Henderson said, replacing his glasses and looking directly at Martin, "you've been operating under the assumption that Mrs. Mitchell owned Mitchell Consulting Services." "Of course she owned it," Martin snapped. "She built it from nothing. Everyone knows that." I felt something twist in my stomach. Not fear, exactly. Something else. Something I hadn't felt in years. Henderson opened a thick folder and pulled out a document. "According to the corporate filings I have here, Mitchell Consulting Services was never actually owned by Margaret Mitchell." The air in the room seemed to thicken. Martin's face went pale, then red, then pale again. "That's impossible. You're reading something wrong. I assure you, these documents are correct." Henderson held up a certificate of incorporation. Mitchell Consulting Services, established in 1981, is wholly owned by Donald Mitchell Holdings, LLC. My heart started beating faster. I knew that name, of course. I just hadn't heard it spoken aloud in so long that it sounded foreign in this room, in this context. Martin stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. "Donald Mitchell Holdings? What the hell is Donald Mitchell Holdings?" Henderson looked at me, with something that might have been respect. "Perhaps Mr. Mitchell would like to explain?" All eyes turned to me. Ava's were wide with confusion. Martin's were narrowed with suspicion. I could feel the weight of their stares, the expectation that I would say something, explain something, justify my existence in some way. But I didn't say anything. Not yet. I'd learned a long time ago that silence could be more powerful than words. That sometimes the best thing you could do was let other people fill the quiet with their own assumptions, their own fears. Martin was practically vibrating with agitation. "Donald, what is he talking about? What is Donald Mitchell Holdings?" I met his gaze steadily. After 7 years of looking away, of accepting his insults and dismissive comments, I finally looked him in the eye. "It's my company." The words were simple, quiet, but they landed in the room like a grenade. "Your company?" Martin's voice cracked slightly. "You don't have a company. You don't have anything." Henderson cleared his throat. "Actually, according to these records, Donald Mitchell Holdings, LLC owns not just Mitchell Consulting Services, but several other business entities as well." He began reading from a list. "Mitchell Property Management, which handles the rental properties you mentioned. Mitchell Financial Services, which provides investment consulting to small businesses. And Mitchell Development Group, which owns several commercial properties throughout the city." Each name hit Martin like a physical blow. His confident posture crumbled a little more with every revelation, but he wasn't ready to give up yet. "This doesn't make sense," he said, his voice getting higher. "Donald doesn't know anything about business. He's never worked a real job in his life. He's just Margaret's husband." Ava finally found her voice. "Dad, is this true?" I looked at my daughter, this woman I'd raised, who'd grown up thinking her father was a failure, who'd married a man who treated me like hired help, who'd stopped calling, stopped visiting, stopped caring because she was embarrassed by what she thought I was. "Yes," I said simply. "It's true." Martin slammed his hand on the table. "This is bullshit. There's no way Donald owns anything. Look at him. He drives a 15-year-old Honda. He shops at Walmart. He doesn't even have a proper job." Henderson's eyebrows raised slightly. "Mr. Martin, I think you may have misunderstood how wealth works. Some of the richest people in the world drive old cars and shop at discount stores. But he's so ordinary," Martin sputtered. "He's nothing special. He never talks about work, never mentions investments or deals or anything important. That's because he didn't need to," Henderson said quietly. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, the whisper of the air conditioning, the distant sound of traffic outside. But mostly I could hear the gears turning in Martin's head as he tried to process what this meant for him, for his plans, for his future. Ava was staring at me like she was seeing a stranger. "Dad, why didn't you ever tell us?" Before I could answer, Martin jumped back into attack mode. "This has to be some kind of mistake or fraud. Yeah, that's it. Donald somehow put everything in his name illegally. Margaret was the real owner. She was the one with the brains, the vision, the work ethic." Henderson looked at Martin with the kind of patience usually reserved for difficult children. "I can assure you everything was done legally and with Mrs. Mitchell's full knowledge and consent." "Then why did everyone think Margaret owned the business?" Martin demanded. This time I answered, "Because that's what we wanted people to think." My voice was calm, steady. For the first time in years I felt like myself again. Not the bumbling husband, not the family burden, not the old lazy bum. Just myself. Martin's face was turning an alarming shade of red. "Why would you want people to think that?" I allowed myself a small smile. "Because it kept people like you away." The words hit their target. Martin stepped backward like I'd slapped him. "People like me? People who are only interested in what they can get. People who measure worth by bank accounts and job titles. People who think being successful gives them the right to treat others like garbage." Martin's mouth opened and closed, like a fish out of water. For the first time since I'd known him, he was speechless. Ava was crying now, quiet tears that she didn't bother to wipe away. "Dad, I don't understand. If you owned everything, why did you let us treat you like I was worthless?" I finished for her. "Because I wanted to see who you really were. Who all of you really were." The room fell silent again. Henderson was watching everything unfold with the detached interest of someone who'd seen family drama play out in his office many times before. Martin finally found his voice again, but it was different now, smaller, less certain. "So what does this mean? For the inheritance? For the will?" Henderson looked down at his papers. "Well, that's where things get interesting. You see, Mrs. Mitchell couldn't leave her husband a business that was already his. What she's actually left behind are her personal assets, her savings, her jewelry, and her share of the joint accounts." "Her share?" Martin's voice was barely a whisper. "Approximately $57,000, Henderson said matter-of-factly. I watched Martin's dreams of instant wealth crumble in real time. His face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, rage, and finally, something that looked like panic, but I wasn't done yet, not even close. "Henderson," I said, my voice carrying an authority that surprised even me, "I think it's time we discuss the real reason we're all here today." Henderson nodded and reached for another folder, this one thicker than the first. As he opened it, I caught Martin's eye. For 7 years, this man had treated me like I was invisible, like I was nothing more than an inconvenience in his perfect life. Now he was staring at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "The truth," I said, leaning back in my chair, "is that Margaret and I have been playing a very long game." Ava wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "What do you mean, Dad?" I looked at my daughter, this beautiful woman who'd grown up thinking her father was a failure. It broke my heart, but it had been necessary. "Ava, do you remember when you were in college and you told us about that boy who was pursuing you? The one from the wealthy family?" She nodded, confused by the change of subject. "You said he only seemed interested after he found out about your mother's business. You were smart enough to see through him then, but somehow you didn't see through Martin." Martin's face flushed red. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," I said calmly, "that Margaret and I decided a long time ago to test the people who came into our family's life. We wanted to know if they loved Ava for who she was, or for what they thought she could give them." Henderson cleared his throat. Perhaps I should explain the business structure. I nodded. Please do. Henderson pulled out several documents. Donald Mitchell Holdings was established in 1979, 2 years before Mitchell Consulting Services. Over the past 43 years, it has grown to encompass a network of businesses and investments worth approximately $18.4 million. I watched the number hit Martin like a physical blow. He actually staggered. 18 million? Ava whispered. Give or take, I said. The exact figure depends on the market. Martin sank into his chair like his legs couldn't support him anymore. But you live in that little house, you drive that old car. You shop for clothes at the mall. Because that's all I need, I said simply. Money doesn't have to change how you live, Martin. It just gives you choices. Henderson continued reading from his documents. The businesses under the Donald Mitchell Holdings umbrella employ over 200 people across the city. Mitchell Consulting Services, which everyone believed was owned by Margaret, was actually just one small part of a much larger operation. But Margaret ran the consulting business, Ava said, still trying to make sense of everything. She did, I agreed. She was brilliant at it. She had the personality for client relations, the vision for growth. I was better suited to the background work, the investments, the property acquisitions, the long-term planning. So why the secret? Martin asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked at him for a long moment. Because 20 years ago we learned that money attracts the wrong kind of people. Margaret's first business partner tried to steal from her. Her own brother asked for loan after loan until we had to cut him off. Friends started treating us differently when they found out how well we were doing. I stood up and walked to the window looking out at the city I'd helped build through my investments. So we made a decision. We would let Margaret be the public face of success while I remained invisible. That way we could see people's true nature. And what did you see in me? Martin asked, though he sounded like he already knew the answer. I turned back to face him. I saw someone who was more interested in status than in my daughter's happiness. Someone who treated people differently based on what he thought they could do for him. That's not true, Martin protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? I asked. When was the last time you asked me about my interests, my thoughts, my feelings? When was the last time you treated me like a person instead of an embarrassment? Martin opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. We both knew the answer. Ava was crying harder now. Dad, I'm so sorry. We treated you terribly. No, I said gently. You treated me exactly how Martin taught you to treat me. You were young when you married him. You learned to see me through his eyes. Henderson shuffled his papers again. Perhaps we should discuss the implications of these revelations. I returned to my seat. Yes, let's do that. Martin was gripping the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles were white. So what happens now? To the business? To everything? That depends, I said. On what? On whether you're capable of change. The room fell silent except for the sound of Ava's quiet sobbing. I reached over and took her hand. She looked up at me with red, swollen eyes. I never wanted you to think I was a failure, I said softly. But I needed to know that the man you married would love you even if your family had nothing. I needed to know he would treat you well regardless of money or status. And? She whispered. I looked at Martin, who was staring at the floor like it might open up and swallow him. And I learned that your husband is the kind of man who calls his wife's father a lazy bum at her mother's funeral. Martin's head snapped up. You were just showing me exactly who you are, I finished. The question now is whether that's who you want to remain. Henderson cleared his throat. There are some practical matters to discuss. The business operations will continue as usual, but there will need to be some changes in the management structure. What kind of changes? Martin asked, and I could hear the panic creeping into his voice. I smiled for the first time since Margaret had died. Not a happy smile exactly, but something close to satisfaction. Well, that's the interesting part, Martin. You see, you've been working for me for the past 5 years. His face went completely white. What? Peterson and Associates, your company? It's actually a subsidiary of Mitchell Development Group. I've been your ultimate boss this entire time. Martin looked like he was about to be sick. That's impossible. Henderson pulled out another document. I'm afraid it's quite possible. The acquisition was completed 5 years ago through a series of holding companies. Mr. Mitchell has been observing your work performance and your treatment of other employees during that time. I leaned forward, looking Martin directly in the eyes. And I've seen how you treat the janitors, the secretaries, the people you think are beneath you. The same way you've been treating me. Martin's career, his future, his entire sense of self-worth was crumbling before his eyes. And for the first time in 7 years, I wasn't the one being humiliated, but I wasn't finished yet. There was still one more card to play. Martin was hyperventilating. I could see his chest rising and falling rapidly as the full weight of his situation crashed down on him. His perfectly styled hair was disheveled from running his hands through it, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "This can't be happening," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone in the room. "This can't be real." But it was real, more real than anything that had happened in this family for years. Henderson was still reading from his documents, his voice steady and professional. "According to the employment records, Martin has been flagged multiple times for inappropriate workplace behavior, specifically condescending treatment of support staff and junior employees." I remembered getting those reports. Each one had felt like a knife twisting in my chest, not because I was surprised, but because they confirmed everything I already knew about the man my daughter had married. "There was an incident last March," Henderson continued, "where Martin publicly berated a cleaning woman for accidentally bumping into him in the elevator. He called her." Henderson paused, glancing at the document. "Several unprofessional terms that I won't repeat in mixed company." Ava gasped. "Martin, you didn't." Martin's head snapped up. "It wasn't. I was having a bad day. She should have been more careful." "She was 73 years old," I said quietly. "Her name is Rosa Martinez. She's been working for the company for 12 years. She has 6 grandchildren, and she sends half her paycheck to her daughter who's fighting cancer in Guatemala." Martin stared at me. Why do you know that?" "Because I make it my business to know about the people who work for me, all of them, from the CEO down to the newest janitor." I leaned back in my chair. "Rosa asked for time off to visit her daughter last month. Do you know what your supervisor told her?" Martin's face was pale. "I don't. He told her the company didn't provide charity leave for family sob stories." Those were his exact words. I felt the familiar anger rise in my chest. "The supervisor who learned that attitude from you, Martin. The supervisor who thought he was impressing his boss by being just as cruel as you are." "I'm not cruel," Martin whispered, but there was no conviction in his voice. Henderson turned to another page. "There's also the matter of Martin's expense reports. Several instances of charging personal expenses to company accounts. Dinners that were claimed as business meetings but were actually personal celebrations. Hotel rooms booked for family vacations and listed as conference expenses." This was news to me. I'd known about Martin's treatment of employees, but the financial irregularities were a surprise, not a pleasant one. "Is that true?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Martin's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. "It was just. Everyone does it. Little things. It doesn't hurt anyone." "It hurts the company," I said. "It hurts every honest employee who follows the rules, and it hurts the trust that makes business relationships possible." Ava was staring at her husband like she'd never seen him before. "Martin, how could you steal from Dad's company?" "I wasn't stealing." Martin exploded, his composure finally cracking completely. "I was just adjusting things, making up for all the times I've been underpaid, underappreciated. Do you have any idea what it's like working for people who don't value your contributions?" I almost laughed at the irony. "No, Martin. Tell me what that's like." He was pacing now, his hands shaking. "This is insane. You can't just ruin my life because you don't like me." "I'm not ruining your life," I said calmly. "I'm showing you the consequences of the choices you've made." Henderson cleared his throat. "There are several options moving forward, Mr. Mitchell could terminate Martin's employment immediately with cause, which would void his severance package and potentially expose him to legal action for the expense account irregularities." Martin went completely white. "Legal action? Alternatively," Henderson continued, "Mr. Mitchell could offer a different arrangement." I stood up and walked to the window again. The city looked different from up here, smaller somehow. All those years of being made to feel small, and I'd been looking down at the world that had dismissed me. "I've been thinking about this for a long time," I said without turning around, "about what I would do when this day came, because I knew it would come eventually." "What do you mean?" Ava asked quietly. I turned back to face them. "Your mother's death wasn't sudden, Ava. We knew it was coming for months. The cancer gave us time to plan, to make arrangements, to have difficult conversations." Ava's face crumpled. "Why didn't you tell me she was sick?" "Because we wanted to see how our family would handle the crisis. Would you rally together? Would you support each other? Or would you show your true colors?" I looked at Martin, who was slumped in his chair like a deflated balloon. "Today, at your mother's funeral, you showed me exactly who you are. You saw an opportunity to profit from grief, and you took it without hesitation." Martin looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw something other than arrogance in his eyes. Fear, maybe, or regret. "What are you going to do?" "That depends on you," I said. "I'm going to give you a choice. Henderson pulled out one final document. This is a separation agreement. If Martin signs it, he will resign from his position at Peterson and Associates with a modest severance package. He will also agree to repay the company for any inappropriate expenses, and he will sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding the family's business interests. Martin's hands were shaking as he reached for the document. And if I don't sign it, then I fire you for cause and pursue criminal charges for embezzlement, I said simply. You'll never work in this industry again, and you'll likely face jail time. The room was silent except for the sound of Martin's ragged breathing. He read through the document, his face growing paler with each page. This severance package, he said finally. It's barely 3 months' salary. It's more generous than you deserve, I replied. Ava was crying again, quiet tears that she didn't try to hide. Dad, please, he's my husband. He's the father of your grandchildren. I looked at my daughter. This woman I loved more than life itself, who had chosen a man who treated her father like garbage. Ava, I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm doing this to protect you. Protect me from what? From a man who will never respect you the way you deserve to be respected. From a man who measures love by profit margins and social status. Martin suddenly stood up, desperation making his voice crack. I can change. Donald, I swear to you, I can be better. I'll treat you with respect. I'll be the son-in-law you want me to be. I studied his face, looking for any sign of genuine remorse. What I saw instead was the same calculation that had always been there. The same self-interest dressed up as sincerity. Martin, I said sadly, you've had 7 years to show me who you are. You've shown me a man who kicks people when they're down, who steals from his employer, who calls his wife's father a lazy bum at her mother's funeral. I was upset, he pleaded. People say things they don't mean when they're grieving. No, I said firmly. People show who they really are when they're under pressure, and you've shown me everything I need to know. Henderson placed a pen on the table next to the separation agreement. The choice is yours, Martin. Martin stared at the pen like it was a snake coiled to strike. His entire future, his career, his reputation, his marriage, everything hung in the balance. And for the first time in 7 years, I held all the cards. Martin's hand hovered over the pen for what felt like an eternity. In that moment, I could see his entire thought process playing out across his face. The calculation, the desperate search for another option, the slow realization that he had painted himself into a corner with his own arrogance. Finally, with a shaking hand, he picked up the pen and signed his name. The silence that followed was profound, not uncomfortable, not tense, just complete, like the world had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. Henderson gathered the documents with practiced efficiency. I'll file these with the appropriate parties. Martin, you have 30 days to clean out your office and return any company property. Martin nodded numbly. He looked like a man who had just watched his life collapse in slow motion, which I suppose he had. Ava was staring at the signed papers, tears still streaming down her face. What happens now? She whispered. I sat down beside her and took her hands in mine. They were so cold despite the warmth of the room. Now you have a choice to make. She looked up at me with those blue eyes that reminded me so much of her mother. What kind of choice? Whether you want to be part of a family that values character over comfort, integrity over income. I glanced at Martin, who was slumped in his chair like a broken doll. Or whether you want to continue down the path you've been on. I don't understand, she said, though I think she did. Your mother left you $57,000 in her will. It's enough to start over if you want to, enough to build something real, something honest. Martin's head snapped up. Ava, you can't be considering this. He's manipulating you. This whole thing is just some sick game he's been playing. I looked at him with something that might have been pity. Even now, even after everything, he still didn't understand. It wasn't a game, Martin. It was a test, and you failed. Ava was quiet for a long time, thinking. I didn't try to influence her decision. I'd done enough manipulating for one lifetime. This choice had to be hers alone. Finally, she spoke. Dad, why didn't you just tell me the truth years ago? Why let me think you were ordinary? I smiled sadly. Because I wanted you to love me for who I am, not for what I have. I wanted to know that your husband would treat me with respect even if he thought I was nobody special. And he didn't, she said quietly. No, he didn't. She was quiet again, processing everything she'd learned. Her husband was a thief and a bully. Her father was secretly wealthy and had been protecting the family for decades. Her mother had died knowing that their daughter had married the wrong man. I feel so stupid, she whispered. You're not stupid, I said firmly. You're young. You trusted the wrong person. We all make mistakes. Martin stood up suddenly, his face flushed with anger. "This is all your fault," he shouted at me. "You set me up. You made me look bad on purpose." I remained calm, my voice steady. "I didn't make you do anything, Martin. Every cruel comment, every dismissive look, every moment of disrespect, that was all you. But you were testing me. You were waiting for me to fail." "I was hoping you would succeed," I said honestly. "I was praying that my daughter had found a good man who would love her and treat her family with kindness. Instead, I found a man who thinks cruelty is a sign of strength." Henderson stood up and gathered his briefcase. "I believe my work here is done. Donald, I'll have the final paperwork to you by the end of the week." As the lawyer left, the three of us sat in silence. Martin was staring at his hands, probably calculating how he would explain this to his friends, his family, his professional contacts. Ava was staring at me, still trying to reconcile the father she thought she knew with the man sitting beside her. And me? I was thinking about Margaret, about the conversations we'd had in those final months, about the plan we'd made together. "She knew, didn't she?" Ava asked suddenly. "Mom knew what you were planning." I nodded. "She helped me plan it. The timing, the reveal, everything. She wanted to make sure you would be okay after she was gone." "By destroying my marriage?" "By showing you the truth about your marriage," I corrected gently. "The marriage was already destroyed, sweetheart. You just couldn't see it." Martin finally found his voice again, but it was different now, smaller, defeated. "What am I supposed to do now? How am I supposed to support my family?" I looked at him for a long moment. Despite everything he had done, despite all the pain he had caused, I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only sadness for what might have been. "You're a smart man, Martin. You have skills, experience, connections. You'll find another job. Not in this city," he said bitterly. "Not once word gets out. Then maybe it's time to start over somewhere else. Somewhere you can be the man you should have been all along." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think I can just change? Just become a different person?" "I think you can if you want to," I said, "but you have to want to, really want to. Not because you got caught, not because you're facing consequences, but because you finally understand that treating people with cruelty is wrong." Martin was quiet for a long time. Then he looked at Ava, and I saw something in his expression that I hadn't seen before. Genuine remorse. "I'm sorry," he said to her. "I'm sorry for the man I became. I'm sorry for the way I treated your father. I'm sorry for making you choose." Ava was crying again, but softer now. "I know you are. Will you come with me? If I leave the city, start over, will you give me another chance?" She looked at him, then at me, then back at him. The weight of the decision was written across her face. "I need time to think," she said finally. Martin nodded and stood up. "I'll be at home when you're ready to talk." After he left, Ava and I sat together in the lawyer's office, listening to the sounds of the city filtering through the windows. Traffic, construction, life continuing despite the earthquake that had just shaken our family. "Dad," she said eventually, "what do you want me to do?" I took her hand and squeezed it gently. "I want you to be happy. Really, truly happy. Not the kind of happiness that depends on money or status or other people's approval. The kind that comes from living with integrity and being loved for who you are." She leaned against my shoulder the way she used to when she was little. "I missed you," she whispered. "I missed my dad." "I've been right here all along," I said, stroking her hair. "I never went anywhere." We sat like that for a while, father and daughter, finding our way back to each other across the years of distance and misunderstanding. Later, as we walked out of the building together, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Peace, not the kind that comes from winning or getting revenge, but the deeper kind that comes from finally being seen for who you really are. I had spent 7 years being invisible, being dismissed, being treated like I didn't matter. But now my daughter knew the truth. She knew that her father wasn't a failure, wasn't lazy, wasn't worthless. She knew that he had loved her enough to endure years of humiliation just to protect her. And that knowledge, that connection between us, was worth more than all $18 million in my accounts. As we walked to our cars, Ava turned to me one last time. "Dad, will you teach me about the business, about everything Mom knew?" I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in years. "I'd love to." 3 months later, I was sitting in my real office, not the cramped spare bedroom that everyone thought was my only workspace, but the corner office on the 20th floor of the building I'd owned for 15 years. Ava was across from me, reviewing quarterly reports with the kind of focus and intelligence that reminded me of her mother. Martin had taken a job in Denver. He and Ava were attending counseling sessions over video calls, working through their relationship slowly, carefully. I didn't know if they would make it, but I hoped they would. Not because I forgave him, forgiveness would take time, but because I wanted my daughter to be happy. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Mitchell?" Rosa Martinez is here for your 3 o'clock appointment. Send her in, I said. Rosa entered hesitantly, the same woman Martin had humiliated months earlier, but she looked different now, stronger, more confident. Mr. Mitchell, she said in accented English, I wanted to thank you personally. The scholarship fund I'd established in Margaret's name had paid for Rosa's daughter's cancer treatment. Her granddaughter was starting college in the fall, fully funded. Rosa herself had been promoted to head of facilities management, with a salary increase that would change her family's life forever. No need to thank me, Rosa. You've earned everything you've received. After she left, I sat alone in my office looking out at the city I'd helped build from the shadows. Margaret's picture sat on my desk, and I could almost hear her laughing at the irony of it all. For 40 years, I'd been the man behind the curtain, the invisible force that made everything work. I'd been content with that role, happy to let others take the credit as long as the work got done and the people I loved were protected. But now, finally, I could step into the light. Not because I needed recognition or praise, but because hiding was no longer necessary. The test was over. The truth was out, and I was free.